Hello and welcome to part 4 of 4, the final part in, yes, Unit 5, the Medo-Persian Wars Part 1, in which we are focusing on the Battle of Marathon, which is in the second Persian invasion. What happened to the first Persian invasion, you may ask? Glad you asked. Now, you'll notice that the first Persian invasion crosses into Thrace, which you will remember is the home of the Thracian Peltasts. This is Persian territory, and then sets sail on Athens. Why Athens? Well, in the years leading up to the first Persian invasion, Athens had been sending its representatives into Persian-held city-states in Ionia and talking them into revolting from Persia successfully. Persia Persia chose to put down these revolts, which is a sensible choice if you want to maintain your empire. And they decided that Athens needed put in its place. Now, some people view this as an attempted full-scale invasion and takeover of Greece. That's not what modern historians think now. Certainly from the Persian point of view, this is a punitive expedition. The Persians are just coming over to Athens to burn some stuff down, knock some stuff around, and discourage Athens from ever mucking about in Ionia again. So it's not to say Persia isn't thinking about taking over Greece. It just doesn't seem to make sense for the kind of mission this is and what ends up happening after the Battle of Marathon. Okay. So Persia puts together a punitive force, so not a full-scale invasion force, but enough that they need a whole fleet of ships to carry their famous cavalry and supplies and infantry. This is the problem with a big army. You have to move them. You have to feed them. And you can either send them over land, which takes longer, which means you have to pay for more dinner, or you can send them over sea, which is a problem because it's on the sea, and being on the sea often leads to being under the sea. And though it may be better down where it's wetter if you're Sebastian the Crab, it is not better if you happen to be, say, the first Persian invasion, which is what happens to the first Persian invasion. They set sail off of Cape Athia. You can see here along the red dotted line the Persian fleet sailing into the Aegean Sea, and then you'll notice the arrow just kind of ends. Yeah, there's a storm, frequent storms in this area because we're in an area of the Mediterranean that tends to trap wind against the mountains and create particularly vicious and fast-moving storms. So storms blow up out of nowhere and they can very quickly sink you. It's also a sea that's full of tiny islands and a bunch of it's a pretty shallow area, the Aegean Sea, as seas go, which means that if you're caught in a storm, your ships are likely to get smashed onto rocks, pulled into currents, pulled into undertow, and generally sunken. Well, that's the first Persian invasion. Some people don't even count this one, and they'll call the second Persian invasion the first, which is why don't use Wikipedia for this. Because the numbering will vary. In this course, we're counting this because, gosh darn it, if you put together an invasion fleet and people die, that counts, at least for me. So first Persian invasion does not make it into Greece. But, I don't know, maybe they got a hold of King Triton's lands or something. One can hope. Probably they died. Okay. Undeterred, because Persia has, like, not bottomless, but pretty massive reserves of men and material, and it is this important to them to make an example out of Athens, and Athens, now ally in Sparta. Persia sends a second invasion. This one actually gets there. You will notice they take a different route. This is because Persia is not stupid. They realize, okay, overseas is probably a bad move, so let's try island hopping, which is what they do. They come along this archipelago of islands scattering across the southern edge of the Aegean Sea. up to the back route into Athens. We'll look at the topographical map in a minute to make some sense of why they're coming this way other than the islands. But the problem with island hopping is that it takes longer. You can stop and refuel and conquer people on your way, but it takes longer and you can still end up in a sea storm. So it's kind of a middle road between overland and open-ish sea. It works. The Persians actually get there this time. Gold star. Let's see how this worked out for them. Yes, so we're looking here at the Marathon coin of Athens because, spoiler, Athens. Exactly, Athens wins this battle. Yay, Athens. No, yay, Athens? Oh, okay. You were rooting for Persia. I'm so sorry. The first of many disappointments in your life. Bull. Bull? Bull what? Bull. Okay. High five? High five. High five. Okay. Let's continue this slide. So Athens wins the Battle of Marathon, and we're not sure if this is a coincidence or not, but I'm going to lean into this here. In the years after the battle... Yes, I know. Marathon is exciting. In the years after the Battle of Marathon, Athens makes a slight edit to their coin. So here we're looking at the seal of democratic Athens. This is stamped into their coinage. The owl is sacred to Athena, hence owl. There's the olive tree, also sacred to Athens and Athena. Athens is named after its goddess Athena. The ath bit is a tip off there. And indeed, written on the margin of the coin are the Greek letters alpha, theta, epsilon, so Athe, which is the first three letters of Athens. Yes, I know, Athens. But then there's this little crescent moon here. I'm circling in red. You can see it here on this fancy smancy gold coin. What's up with the crescent moon? Well, there's a story. I mentioned that Sparta was an ally of Athens during this fight. They, along with Athens, were unenthused about giving Persia earth and water. They wanted to maintain local control, and so therefore they agreed to support Athens if Persia came for Athens. Oh, okay, yes, you can have the cup. So Persia began island hopping. Athens knew they were coming, so they sent a messenger to Sparta. The guy's name is Pheidippides. Remember his name. We'll be talking about him in a bit. So Pheidippides was sent to run all the way from Athens to Sparta, which is a very long trip, mind you. It took us a couple days when we were driving. Probably if you drove straight, you could get there, but it's a stretch. So he runs all the way to Sparta, and he arrives during Sparta's Carneia. So this is a harvest festival. And the Spartans are like, hey, Athens, sorry about your Persian problem, but yeah, it's the Carneia, and we kind of have a religious law against going to war while the moon is waning. So if it's okay with you, you just need to hang in until the moon begins waxing again, and then we will totally come and bail you out. So just sit tight, Athens. Sparta is coming. Sparta didn't make it until after the battle. They show up only to find that Athens has won, and then Athens takes them on a tour of the battlefield. They're like, this is where we won over here, and this is where we won over here, and this is where the Plataeans helped us win over here. By winning? Yes, by winning. Yeah, they're just winning all the time. It's fantastic. So Athens isn't really into letting things go. Oh gosh, you've slimed my glasses, James. Then they keep bringing it up, and they put what appears to be a waning moon on their coinage. So this is essentially a a way that every time that you pay for your groceries in Athens, you can remind Sparta about that time they wouldn't fight with you at the Battle of Marathon because they had to wait for the moon.
He literally just said, "Suck it, Sparta."
No, don't. Not in the back of... my students heard that. I'm not re-recording this slide. You guys are just going to have to cope with that. What was I doing? Yes. All right. So Sparta would not come to this battle, and Athens is not going to shut up about it for the next 10 years, which is going to be very important in the third Persian invasion, where Sparta is yet again under attack during the Carnea, so we'll see what they do at that point. But poor Pheidippides has to run all the way to Sparta and all the way back to Athens just to say, yeah, about the Spartans, they're not coming. Very disappointing. Here is a topographical map as promised. So let's talk about why the Persians are coming in at the Bay of Marathon and not in Athens. This has everything to do with Cape Sunion. That's here in red. I'm outlining this promontory sticking down south. So this cape curves around the Saronic Gulf. The city of Athens proper is north, right here. Their port, the Piraeus, is a couple of miles downhill and right on the sea there. What this means is that the Athenians can put scouts on the top of Mount Hymettus here and also have relay towers up the Cape of Sunion. They have a watchtower here. They know that Persia is coming if Persia goes around the Cape, which means that if Persia attempts a landing here, even though this wasn't a fortified harbor during this period, they would still be facing the massed forces of Athens. It's just not a great tactical move, and you're also bracketed in between two mountain ranges along the side of Athens. It's just not the best route of attack. So the Persians, cleverly, choose to land instead at the Bay of Marathon here. And there's a convenient road going from Marathon to the city of Athens through this pass between Mount Pentelicon and Mount Hymettus. The Bay of Marathon itself has beaches that are shallow enough for a good landing, so this is an amphibious assault, and it allows the Persians to land their horses, and because horses can come up this roadway, this is actually a great invasion route if you happen to have a mounted cavalry and a large infantry. So Marathon's a sensible place to land. However, Athens knows they're coming. At first, Athens thinks that Sparta's gonna bail them out. Doesn't happen. However, the Plataeans, Plataea is over here. Remember that name. We'll be talking about its horrible demise in Unit 6. Or is it 7? Eventually, Plataea. Sorry, spoilers. But in this battle, they send people to fight with the Athenians. So it's the Athenians, the Plataeans, a couple of other locals on the plain of Marathon coming together under the leaders of what is then a new democratic government. So Athens had expelled its tyrants, and at this point they had gone in for a system of military command in which every year 10, count them, 10 generals are elected. So like, how do you decide what general's in charge on what day, you may ask? Great question. Well, there's a rotating schedule, so every day a new general gets to be in charge, but apparently the only general who was particularly competent, or at least the one who had a plan in this particular engagement, was a dude named Miltiades. That name is important. I've mentioned him earlier. Miltiades is the guy who ironically ends up living in Persia. But we're not there yet. Miltiades right now is the guy who has a plan to defeat the Persians, and Athens really needs one. So the Athenian hoplites march down the road to Marathon, where they set up somewhere in here on the high ground, which is very clever. Taking the high ground and attacking from there allows them to control this roadway, effectively pinning the Persians in the Bay of Marathon. and that's how the Athenians managed to initiate a standoff. So the Persians have landed on the beach, the Athenians are holding the high ground and able to block the road, and then the Athenians proceed to wait 10 days until it's Miltiades' turn to be in command, at least according to Herodotus again. Historians have so many questions about this. Okay, question number 1 is the angle of attack. So when the battle itself happens, we're not entirely sure where the Persians are standing and where the Athenians under Miltiades' command, yes, are standing. This is an goodness gracious, little man. So this is an older model. I'm not exactly. Yeah, I would say that the state of the field is still fights at convention bars on this one. Yes, yes, yes. Why are you biting my hand? You are not teething. You are unhelpful. You are very unhelpful. So here, you explain this angle of attack. Okay. What was I doing? Stop biting. Why are you biting? This is what happens when you raise your children by cats. Now he's making fart noises. Okay. Mr. Spouse.
Where the biting came from.
Oh, okay. Here.
He wants to play shark.
Okay. Okay, he has an appointment with a shark puppet. Thank you, Mr. Spouse. Okay, what were we talking about? This is going to be a great video. All right. Battle of Marathon, angle of attack. Okay, so in the traditional model, and this is taking Herodotus very literally, not just Herodotus, but other early accounts of the battle, they mention that the Persians' backs are to the sea. So if we're going to take that really literally, if your backs are to the sea, then you are lined up in an array like so, with your backs to the sea, and then the Greeks are making their charge here, coming down from their camp like so. On the one side, or on either side, there are what may or may not be trees that the Greek defenders have cut down, made into an artificial stake field in order to keep the Persians from spreading out, and possibly also to foil the Persian cavalry, because keep in mind, cavalry are very sensitive to pointy sticks coming up out of the ground. So okay, this makes some sense. But the question we immediately ask about this is, who in their dang right mind would spend 10 days hanging out on the beach with your back to the sea? That's a really unwise position to take up by choice, for exactly the reasons that we end up seeing in this battle. The Persians end up getting pushed back into the water, and they try to get back onto their ships, and they struggle to do this. The Greeks are like grabbing onto the ships so that they can kill more Persians. It does fit with the account, but it's also a little bit of a head scratcher. Like, the beach, really? Especially when there's other land nearby that makes more sense. There's a little bit of higher ground here. This area is all marshy land, so it looks like solid land, but it's actually this very soggy sort of alluvial deposit thing, which is going to bring us to our first suggestion of a tweak to this model. All right, so angle of attack, suggestion 1 looks like this. Angle of attack suggestion 2 is much like the angle of the attack suggestion 1, wherein the Persians still have their backs to the sea. Yeah, the Greeks are still coming at them from the same angle. But on either side, we're interpreting a word we'll be looking at later as just like scrubby land. So this, in this model, it's not man-made stick fields, it's just natural scrubby land, which is similarly hard for horses to ride on. So okay, that does make sense. But the big difference in this model, you'll notice the Persian fleet is over here. Now, this is a sensible place to park your fleet if your fleet's going to sit there for 10 days. This... No, sorry, a puppet shark is eating my son. Not a sensible place to park your fleet, because even though you're protected a little bit from Euboea, strong currents and waves coming in from the ocean are going to push you into the sandbars and the alluvial marshy swamp. Not a great place to park your fleet, but here there's a little cape of solid land projecting into the sea. That's going to create a breakwater. It's going to keep your ships from smashing into each other and getting grounded on the beach. So it's a sensible parking spot. And this may also explain why the Persians have difficulty getting back onto the ships to leave, is because if the ships are like over here on the other side of a swamp, well, okay, that makes sense. So once the Persian lines break, instead of going like just like jumping into the water, let me do this with a different color. We're doing this in green now. So instead of jumping into the water, that's bad. Right, we'll go with this green. Instead, they have to go like along this swampy land and then through the swamp and onto the ships. So, okay, that makes sense too. But we're not done. There's yet another model for how the Battle of Marathon may have looked like on the ground. All right. Okay, Model 3. You'll notice a lot of things have moved this time, including the Greek camp. We are not entirely sure where the Greek camp is. The initial assumption that it was somewhere up here-ish on Mount Pentelicon. This model, however, suggests that they're on a different slope nearby here at Agrialiki. Also high ground, so this is a Greek camp on high ground. This puts the Greek camp a lot closer to the front line of the Persians. More about line in a minute. This means that in order to attack at a run, which we know the Athenians and Plataeans did in this engagement, they don't have to run all the way from up here down to the beach and the Persians are just like, what, waiting for them? Rather, they just have to come down from Agrialiki onto the plain and then rush at the Persians. And this makes a certain amount of sense too from the Persian side, because they don't have their literal back to the sea, but they do have a slope here keeping their cavalry from moving this way too easily. And they could go up along this river, but they'd have to cross the river to charge. It's not a great cavalry position, and we'll talk about why this looks like there's a cavalry here. We question that too. So actually, let me put a question mark. Cavalry. Their camp would be right along this marshland. So when the infantry breaks and runs, caught off guard by the Athenians just running at them, then they'd have to retreat through the marsh to their sensibly parked fleet, or they'd have to wheel along the beach, or they'd have to jump into the water and swim. The point being, getting the heck out of there would have meant going through water. So effectively, the Persians are backed up to the sea, even if it's not their literal backs. They're more like left-sided to the sea. But that's not a phrase in ancient Greek or English. We don't say your right side is, well, I mean, you could say your right side is to the sea, but like backed up against the sea is our expression, and an ancient expression too, for being kind of cornered. So those are our 3 best guesses based on the written records. One of the problems facing us as historians is that at the time, so in the generations after the Battle of Marathon, because the Athenians never shut up about it, ancient authors assume you know how this works, so they don't explain it too well. Before you get too judgy about ancient sources, though, think about all the things we don't explain for future people. Like, how are future people going to figure out how a cell phone works, or how Windows XP functions, from just reading the stuff that we talk about and say on, I don't know, Facebook, unless they have like the Windows help files archive or something, which we only have this small, tiny percentage of written evidence from the ancient world to begin with, very fragmentary and very third, fourth, fifth hand information. Because of this, and this is a problem with warfare history in general, we have to do a lot of guessing, and it's not because we're lazy, and it's not because we don't want to believe the written sources. It's because the written sources assume that we know stuff that we don't know. And I found that kind of interesting, actually. It's really fun to sit around and think, okay, like, what are they describing here? So let's keep unpacking this, shall we? Onto the charge itself. So this is a picture taken along the plain of Marathon, and even today it's still marshy, even with marsh draining efforts and local waterworks in the area. This is still swampy, brushy, bristly ground, but it is very flat, unusually flat for Greece, which is why the Persian cavalry would have been pretty comfortable disembarking here. There's also a lot of grass, horses like that. It means you don't have to carry as much grass in your fleet. That's important. So here we are looking from the marshy area across the plain. This is the peak. Let me do this in red, actually. So this is the peak in the third model, below number 3 here, where we think the Athenian camp would have been. In other models, the Athenian camp is put here. So I'll put 1 and 2. It's a horrible 2. There, now it's a 2. Then the Persians are either arrayed here, this way, or they're arrayed, so this is 1 and 2. We'll do this in a different color. We'll make them purple. Oh, that's yellow. Okay. So versions 1 and 2. In version 3, the Persians are like here, right at the line where the trees are. So that's model 3 for the Persians. Either way, this is a very long distance to charge in a hoplite phalanx formation without people straggling and getting out of order. This is partly why the hoplitodromos is an Olympic event. Being able to run in armor is a skill. Being able to run in armor and skill in step with your ranks intact, that's a real skill. If you've been in marching band, you can relate. Or say if you've been in the military, you've probably had to do this. It takes a lot of practice. And for a citizen army, it's a bit of an ask, which is one of the reasons why we know about it, because the Athenians like to brag about this. So yeah, okay, great. They were running. We're not sure how long for, though, especially if the Athenians begin, let me go back to my red for the Athenians, if they begin up here and they're running all the way down here, that is a really long way to run in armor, in formation, and then fight a battle that, at least according to Herodotus, seems to go on for a pretty darn long time. We're talking hours, which for an ancient battle is a very long time. Battles tend to be very quick because they're essentially a game of Red Rover. Once you break through that line with your hoplites, things conclude pretty quickly. So for a hoplite battle of this period, it's a long battle. And you're going to get super tired, and there's not a great way to rotate fresh troops to the front of a phalanx line. So something the Romans are going to be troubleshooting coming up, so keep an eye out for that. So if we accept model number 3, and I'm showing my cards a little bit, I'm fond of model number 3. It's a much shorter run if you're going to run the whole way. But this doesn't necessarily mean that 3 is more correct. Some people have suggested that with models 1 and 2, they marched at a quick walk most of the way and then ran the rest of the way. The shore also would have been a little bit closer inland too, so it's not quite as much distance as it looks like here, but that's still a really long march, and the Persians would have had time to get their act together pretty quickly. Well, pretty quickly. They still would have been caught with their literal pants down, actually. They're Persians, they have pants. But it would have been a lot more marked this way. This, I think, is the most sensible angle of attack for an effective surprise attack, which this is. The Athenians just sit there for 10 days and then all of a sudden they're like, banzai, off they go. Okay, we're not done with issues, guys. There's so much more to unpack here, and I'm just getting through the highlights. There's a word in Greek, abatis, and this has an uncertain translation. This can either mean scrubby bushes, or it can mean man-made sticks put into the ground. And as I've hinted at earlier in our models, this makes a lot of difference. If it's natural growth, then we know where it is. We know that it's in the swampy area and it's a natural feature of the land that the Greeks are exploiting. But if it's abatis, this means that the Athenians must have come in before the Persians landed and set up the area so that it was ready to execute this strategy. And this makes a difference, because if the Athenians created this feature on the battlefield, it means that they had a plan to attack as they did at Marathon from the beginning. And that's a very different story than I think Herodotus implies a bit, which is much more attack of opportunity. I'll explain that in a later bullet point. But at any rate, the abatis, what? Does that mean like sticks, trees, what? And again, the authors aren't trying to be vague. It's just they assume we know, but we don't know because, we're missing that information. Next up, there's this two-word phrase in Herodotus that's super duper important and super duper vague. That is, when he's talking about the decision to attack, he mentions that the Persians were horis hipes. I've given it to you in Greek here. It means with the cavalry absent or with the horses gone. We have a lot of questions about that. Does that mean like the horses aren't in position? Does that mean that the horses have just left the area? If so, where did they go? Like, you can't take them through the swamp. You can't take them down the shore because, like, that's rocky and there's a mountain there. It's like, they couldn't have taken them down the road because then they would have attacked Athens. So, like, where did the horses go? Maybe, and this is, I think, very reasonable as an explanation, the horses were loaded onto the Persian fleet in order to take them around the Cape. So the Persians got sick of sitting on their butts looking at the Athenians for 10 days, and they were like, you know what we can do? Let's take our fearsome, awesome Persian cavalry and some archers, let's put them on some of our boats, let's hold the Athenian infantry here in place, because by then they'd figured out, oh my gosh, this is the entire Athenian army. We've got them right here. So let's send our crack troops around the Cape to attack the city of Athens while it's undefended. Let's just jump on them. Awesome. And that's a great idea. It makes a lot of sense. And it also makes sense that the horses never arrive in Athens to carry out this attack, because you'll remember Cape Sunion, it's kind of shaped like real long and narrow. So if the Persian fleet had set sail from the Bay of Marathon going around the Cape, at this point, survivors or lookouts up on the mountain here in the Cape would be able to signal to them like, abort, stop it! Everything went horribly wrong. And then they would have just like turned around and gone back to Persia, which would be sensible if this were a punitive expedition. And that is indeed what happens. The Athenians are able to catch the Persians off guard somehow, whether or not the horses are there. Either like the horses aren't saddled and they manage to push them into the marsh. Although that does seem like there isn't a lot of mention of horses, so it seems like the horses aren't physically there. At any rate, the men and possibly, but probably not horses, they're able to catch out of formation. They don't have their weapons, they don't have their gear. They like push over the tents, and then the Persians sensibly, because they're on a punitive expedition, right? They're like, whoop, this isn't working. They turn around and they jump back on their ships like a sensible person would. Uh, the Athenians control the narrative here because it's the Athenian narrative that's won and been copied and comes down to us. They're like, the Persian cowards, they turned around and they left, and rah, Athens, yay, we won. But shaming people for making a tactical retreat is, I think, and I don't think that this is a particularly off-base opinion. Of course, we always do about our opinions, but that's not a great way to think about tactical retreats. Sometimes the sensible thing is to notice that you have lost, stop investing sunk costs, save your lives, get on the ships, and come back in like 10 years. Which is what the Persians do. I think the Persians make the right call here. They're like, okay, this isn't working. Cut losses, go. And that's what they do. So, I think that getting judgy at the Persians for this one is a bit premature. But nonetheless, the Athenians do succeed in making the Persians not invade their city. So, gold star. Very good. Okay, next question that we historians have of this encounter. Did the Athenians attack for strategic or tactical reasons? What we mean by that. Strategic decisions are decisions that you make ahead of time. So this is a plan that's conceived in the calm before the heat of battle. And this is when your chess pieces are moving according to plan, as it were. So this is the question of, did the Athenians deliberately wait for 10 days, knowing that eventually the Persians would have to move their cavalry? And then because they were waiting for that moment, they noticed, yes, okay, finally the cavalry have moved, we can attack. Awesome. Or was it a tactical offensive? So were the Athenians actually sitting on that hill going, I don't have a plan. Do you have a plan? No, I don't have a plan. Miltiades has a plan. When is it Miltiades Day? Oh, not yet. Like 10 days, Miltiades Day. Okay, awesome. We'll wait for his day. Oh shit, I hope this goes well. And then one day they're like, oh my gosh, they're moving the horses. Oh yes, let's attack them. Good idea. Let's do it. That's a tactical offensive. That's when your plan has made contact with the enemy and you're reacting in the moment to the situation on the ground and you take advantage of an opening. So that's what we mean by a tactical offensive. I think in some ways this is a bit of an academic question because any good commander is going to do both. But it's a question we ask about this, and it's one that you can think of as you read Herodotus. Like, does this look more strategic or tactical to you? And also, one of the great things about Herodotus is he'll sometimes tell you when he has two different versions of the story, and he'll say, like, one guy told me ba-ba-da-ba, but somebody else told me ba-ba-da-ba. So you can compare the two versions. You can be like, all right, this witness seems to be saying it's strategic, this guy seems to be saying it's tactical. What can we make of these two diverging stories? Bless Herodotus, he's super duper useful. Now, finally, and this is a quick one, as I mentioned, we're not quite sure how long this battle took. Hours, the entire day. Some accounts say it went from sun up to sundown, which is a really long time for a battle you start off with running in your armor. But it's not unreasonable either, because most of the fighting is not happening in the initial charge, but rather once the Persians break, and that happens very quickly, and then the Athenians go chasing down every retreating Persian they can get their hands on and kill them, and then make a giant pile of Persian bodies, which is what they show the Spartans when the Spartans show up late, is like, yeah, Sparta, look at the piles of bodies. This one I don't have a ton of opinions on, but you know, part of why we think maybe the sun up to sundown means just a few hours is because ancient people counted inclusively. So often if it's like from sometime in the morning to sometime in the afternoon, that's close enough to sun up to sundown. Ancient time doesn't work like modern time. They have a different notion of what counts as an interval. They don't have clocks like we do. Mechanical timekeeping isn't a thing yet. And this means you have a very different relationship to time and the rhythms of the day. So it is important not to think anachronistically about timekeeping. Now let's talk about Pheidippides. I told you his story wasn't done yet. This is that guy who ran all the way from Athens to Sparta to ask Sparta to pretty please show up, and then all the way back from Sparta to Athens to be like, yeah, the Spartans aren't coming. So Pheidippides then turns around, marches with the hoplites to Marathon, fights in the Battle of Marathon, and then after the battle, they're like, hey, we need a runner to run back to Athens and tell them we won the battle. So that's what Pheidippides does. He runs from the Bay of Marathon all the way to Athens, which is, I think, what, 20... Don't ask me to remember numbers. Look up how long a marathon is, and there you are. That long is the distance from the Bay of Marathon to Athens. So this is the event that triggers the concept of the marathon run, and that's why it is the length it is, because of Pheidippides. However, Pheidippides runs all the way back from the battle, says, "We won," and then he drops dead because he'd run all the way to Sparta and back, fought a battle, and then run to Athens. Glorious and heroic maybe, but I really think that his commanders could have cut the dude a break. However, we still know his name, so yay. Good job, Pheidippides. But I'm not just saying this for a fun fact either. I think it's important to remember that there are more crucial people in a battle than people who are doing literal combat stuff. Combat and warfare is waged not just in the moment when you're sticking spears into other people, but in the moments of communication, coordination, and message runners in the pre-modern era. And I'm talking up to World War I. We still had people physically running from one place to another in World War I before radio was a reliable way of transmitting information, and before radio could be encoded, which is the other limiting factor here for radio. Before that, you had to make people physically run from one place to another place. And the slower they were, the more lag you had, the more there's going to be a disconnect between the strategic and tactical situation, between the plan on paper and what you actually have to do to not die. So people like Pheidippides aren't just a footnote to battle history. People like Pheidippides are an indispensable part of pre-modern warfare. And they're not gone either. Communication personnel are still an important part of making your warfare work well. And we overestimate and leave them out of our stories at our peril. So let's just take a minute. Good job, Pheidippides. Good job. I'm so sorry. You deserved better. And here's where we're left, looking at the funeral inscription to the Athenian dead who were buried on the battlefield. And this was typical of pre-modern battlefields. Before there was technology and infrastructure to bring bodies of the dead back at the end of a war, you'd be buried in the place that you fell. So the war dead at Marathon were buried, and then it was kept as sacred ground by the city of Athens. Just the Athenian and the Plataean dead, mind you, not the Persians. And the Athenians and the Plataeans were buried in separate grave mounds because they're from city-states. So they wouldn't be in the same grave because they identified as having different nationalities, even though they identified as fellow Greeks. So identity is a little complicated here. But this is also a ground on which many, many more, thousands and thousands of Persian allies, including Ionians, Bactrians, Phoenicians, people from all over the world died. Many of them there not because they had anything against Athens, but because they were part of the Persian Empire. They were sent as part of their satrapy's tribute, and they fought because the Persian king sent them there, fought, and then died in this, what must have been a horrifying, terrifying onslaught, and then left in unmarked graves. This ground was thought to be not necessarily creepy haunted, but haunted by the Athenians. The story goes that at twilight, if you stand on the plain of Marathon, you can hear the sounds of clashing battle lines and fighting men. I've been there at twilight. I did not hear ghost armies, and that was a little disappointing, I gotta say. But there is a certain heaviness in the air. It's like many battlefield graveyards, it's a place that gives me a lot of heavy feelings and useful feelings too, because I think we can't ever step away from the reality that when we're talking about war, we're talking about people's deaths for reasons that are complicated and require a good deal of bravery, sacrifice, and pain on both sides, and especially for people who die so far from home. It's a lot of families in Persia who were having to deal with this grief. But the Athenian dead get their epitaph. Here it is, giving you the translation, and I'll read it in Greek because Greek is fun. We teach ancient Greek here at UMBC. You can sign up for it next year. And you should, because ancient Greek is so fun. All right, so here we go. I'm going to read it in the Greek. Helenon promachuntes Athenaioe maratoni, cruciphoron medon estol person dunamin. Now, this is the epitaph, but this is also a bit of a foreshadowing. This is the message the Athenians wanted to send with the Battle of Marathon, that they not only are Hellenes, but they are at the forefront of the Hellenes. They are the leaders of this newly forged identity of Hellenes. They are opposed to the gold-bearing Medes. The word estoperson is related to the Greek word persai, which is their word for both sacking but also the Persians. So there's a framing of an us versus them dichotomy, but an us that's us, but especially the Athenian us. This is a bit of an all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others, if you'll pardon the Animal Farm reference. This is Athenians saying, yeah, we are all free, but we're kind of in charge here. And yeah, thanks for nothing, Sparta. Also, we single-handedly, with the Plataeans, mostly single-handedly, stole credit for winning the Battle of Marathon. And they use this as their rallying cry. They push ahead. They say, hey, Persia came first and we won. You guys who are in Ionia should totally revolt from the Persians. Join with us. Be fellow Hellenes. Don't meet eyes. This emboldens the Athenians and the idea of Hellenicity. This is why there is a third Persian war in part. But also, this becomes a bit of a drumbeat for the Athenians. They begin to take this on as their identity, that like, we are the ones who beat the Persians at Marathon. We saved Greece from an invasion. Of course, it probably was not an invasion of all of Greece, but it very well could have been a first step in an invasion. And Persia's pattern was to invade, so okay, maybe. And then they begin to believe that because they saved Greece, they deserve to keep saving Greece, and they deserve to be the most important voice in Greece. And this is eventually going to lead to a struggle for dominance between Athens and Sparta. That is the Peloponnesian Wars. Not even a full century after the Persian Wars. So in its success, Athens is sowing the seeds for spoilers. Athens loses the Peloponnesian War. So in some ways, Herodotus is a bit right. Athens, in this moment, chooses a course that sends them to their own destruction, not so much standing up to the Persians, but creating a situation in which they start acting like the Persians. They start trying to control the other Greeks, and they think it's okay because we're Greeks, you're Greeks, we're better than the Persians. And eventually, the rhetoric of Hellenes being people with a right to self-determination, city-state by city-state, takes Athens down. And that's where I leave you this unit. More next week.